listeners, we're reaching you from COVID-19 lockdown in Edinburgh and with our very special guest Katie in London, and you're tuning into the Difficult Conversations podcast, which has been born from the COVID-19 pandemic and aims to create less represented, critical and feminist approaches to the outbreak, as well as covering radical and sociological approaches to topics of our times. Today, we are extremely lucky to have consumer expert from Money Saving Expert and my good friend, Katie Watts, here to share her wisdom on all things finance in the context of the pandemic. We will be covering the worry and the change and where we can find stability and safety during this health, social, economic, political and public crisis. We'll be trying to take a more human, personal and even a feminist and sociological approach to financial advice during COVID-19. And Katie is here to help me do just that. So Katie, please help us to cut some clarity through this storm, no pressure. And I'll be kicking off with our first question. So why is the pandemic specifically a financially anxious time for people?
Well, it's basically all the unknowns, there's so much that's being changed right now. There's government policy that's changing in days that normally takes years to be put into action. There's emergency legislation that's going through in less than a week, which is unheard of. And people don't know when this lockdown is going to end either. There's no clarity at the point of recording this podcast. So none of us really have an understanding of how far ahead we're planning into our future. When people are sort of budgeting or making financial decisions, they normally have a bit of an idea of what is coming up and what the next few months or years might look like for them. But right now, that's just so unknown for them. So if you're impacted in a small way, in a big way, or completely financially by the pandemic, right now it's so hard to see what actions you might need to take and how long you might have to sustain the money that you've got. So, it's completely normal for people in their gut to have that horrible little gremlin thrashing around saying, how am I going to pay my bills? How am I going to pay my rent or my mortgage? How am I going to, pay for the cat's food or the kids? How am I going to make sure that in the future I still have a little pot of money that I can rely on for a rainy day? Or am I using my rainy day fund right now? And how long is that going to last me? So, it's completely normal. We're all in this together, but it's difficult. And there are some things that you can do right now to try and ease that burden a little bit.
Absolutely. And I can imagine being on the financial and consumer side of things is also a very quick moving and challenging and anxious time. I'm interested in knowing a bit more about how it's impacted your day to day. So how would you say that COVID-19 has changed the landscape of your daily work, and what new challenges are there from the perspective of being on the advice delivery side of things?
So for any listeners that don't know Money Saving Expert is a consumer organisation and website founded by the personal finance guru, Martin Lewis, and he's a big consumer campaigner as well. And most of our work is around helping people to understand every little bit of society that they can spend money on, understand how bills work, how energy tariffs work, make sure that they choose a product that's right for them based on all the information that we give them. And then the other side is we investigate and we campaign. So we look to uncover things that are sort of wrong or unfair for the consumer in the UK. We dig in and understand the problem and the effect and the impact that it has. And then we campaign, whoever that might be, whether that's an organisation individually or whether that's the government or a government department, to try and make change happen. So we're always working in favour of consumers. But the minute that this coronavirus pandemic really kicked off around the week of the 16th of March, everything changed for us. We were starting to look at flights and travel and all that sort of thing because people were being brought home. Flights to China and other parts of the Far East were being cancelled, and we were starting to sort of understand how to get people home and how to claim on their travel insurance. But the minute that lockdown sort of seemed imminent, we were starting to hear new things from the government every single day. And that meant that we had to dig through and find out what those gaps were. We were listening to our users, listening to people on social media, trying to understand who these policies would not help and who they would help. And in some cases, we've sort of campaigned the government to bring clarity to some of the situations. So, particularly with their employment and self-employment help, there were a lot of things that were really clear as mud before, frankly. And, we are very lucky that we've built up a reputation as a consumer campaigning organisation. We have contacts high up in the government, and it shouldn't take us, but unfortunately it has. So we've worked really hard with the Treasury and HMRC and other relevant government departments to make sure that the issues that our users are telling us about are covered for them. Now, there's a certain amount of to and fro there. The government can say so much, but it's all down to interpretation, and certain things it just won't go further on. It won't, for example, force former employers to take back employees that they had laid off in a panic, but they've made it clear that they can and furlough them. So it's really difficult, and we're hoping to sort of bridge that gap and be the interpreter of the government's information and try to give more clarity, more calls to action for employers, more calls to action to consumers where the government can't itself.
Well, that's why we're so lucky to have you on the podcast today, because people amidst this kind of crisis and climate of panic and hysteria will be looking for sources of trustworthy advice. So we will be linking in Money Saving Experts' work below the video. So please do check that out, listeners. But we will now be doing a bit of a quick fire round to just grill Katie. Are you prepared on some of the hot topics for financial advice during the pandemic? Are you ready? So our first question is, how do we financially protect ourselves during this time? So how do we ensure that we've got income coming in? How do we protect our loved ones? How do we protect ourselves from scams? How do we know where to put our money? Anything that jumps to mind. How would you, in a nutshell, advise people to keep safe financially during this time?
So it's always a good idea to do a money audit at least once a year, but right now more than ever. And some of us have a little bit more time than others right now. So some of us might be on furlough and we're not working. Some of us might be isolating under government advice. So now is a really good time to do that if you've got the brain space to do it. So start with what we call pain-free savings. So things that you don't have to lose, but you could probably cut the cost of. So your energy provider, your broadband provider, could you get a better contract for your mobile phone? Could you benefit from getting a water meter at all? All those things that you're not going to miss, they're not going to change, they're not going to go away, but you could be really cutting the cost. And a lot of us can save hundreds of pounds just doing that. And then look at the painful savings. So, is that weekly magazine that you get through the door? Is that, if you add it up over the course of a year, it probably tots up a lot more than you think, and it's several £100s. Do you really need Sky TV, or can you go and get Freeview instead? Is that going to cover the channels that you need? Is there anything that you're spending money on that you could maybe pull back on a little bit? So are you sort of spending a bit too much money on clothes, for example? Now, most of us probably won't have that problem in this time, but that's a general budgeting tip. Having a look, being really honest with yourself. And then, are you putting stuff aside for costs down the line? So, for example, it's a really good idea to budget a little bit of money, put it in a separate pot for a holiday or for Christmas or for birthdays. And if you do that every month, it doesn't feel quite so painful when the time comes around to buy it. So it's really a good idea. And, if you treat it like a job, if you sit down for a day or two and go through everything, switch your insurance companies, don't auto renew on anything, you might find that it's thousands of pounds. Even remortgaging can do that. That in itself can save you thousands of pounds. Then the second thing is you might have a bit of debt. Cut the cost of it if you can. So some of it might be able to move. You might be able to move some of your debt to a 0% rate. So you might balance transfer a credit card debt, so you're not paying interest on it for a certain amount of months. Or you might be able to money transfer into your overdraft and cut that cost to 0%. Now, we've heard recently that a lot of banks have put their overdraft costs up to 40% because of the regulators' new rules that asked for more clarity, but they seem to have taken advantage a little bit and put the rate up as much as they can, which isn't helping certain groups of people with large overdrafts. So see if you can cut the cost of your debt, pay down expensive debt before you save. So you might be really tempted to try and put some money into a savings account every month, but often the cost of debt, the interest that you accrue on debt, is more than what you're getting in savings rates right now, especially with the low Bank of England base rate. So you might be getting 1 or 2% at an absolute maximum on savings right now, but debt might be costing 15, 16, 17%. So pay down your expensive debt first. And then the third thing is a real big warning from me. Really, really be careful about coronavirus related scams at the moment. This is an issue that I personally run a campaign on, and it is so bad right now. There are so many good people in this situation, but there are also terrible criminals who are coming out of the shadows to prey on our pockets while we're worried about our health and our finances. I'll give you some examples. So there are people that are coming to your door who are claiming to offer home testing kits for a fee, or they might offer to do your shopping and take your money and never come back, or say that they can clean your driveway and that'll kill the bacteria and stop COVID-19 coming into your home, and they'll charge you for that. It's all a scam. Don't open the door to those people. There are email scams going around claiming to be from the World Health Organization that say that they can provide you with a list of people in your area, for a fee or a donation, or they might email you saying, we're looking for investors or good cause donations for the production of PPE, personal protective equipment, or masks or hand sanitizer. It's all fake. You might also find that you can buy some of that stuff online and it's got dangerous products that have been outlawed in, or it doesn't turn up at all once you've paid for it. And also, there's a lot of people that are trying to rush you into making financial decisions, and that's a really good sign that it's a scam. So they'll say, your bank account isn't safe right now because of the crisis, and you need to move your money into this other one right now. It's really awful. So just question any uninvited approaches, anything you weren't expecting or you haven't signed up to. Make sure that you don't get rushed into anything. Hang up the phone, go and independently research the number of that organization if you believe it might be genuine, and ask them yourself. And if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is, sadly.
Some great advice there. Of course, these scams are really frightening, and it's important that we look at them with a lens of kind of age and class and privilege, because the people who are most likely to fall vulnerable to them are the elderly, are people with less computer literacy skills, and are people in more vulnerable positions. So, for example, people with more unstable citizenship status who would be more likely to open an official-looking email and take it for what it's saying it is. Absolutely. Just to kind of pick up on one aspect of that question, I would like you to answer in regards to wages. So the government has rolled out its kind of COVID-19 economic policies, and one of the major headlines from that is that all workers should be receiving an 80% payment of their wages, of their salaries. So how do we ensure that the government actually follows through on that? Are we seeing all workers equally receiving this right? Or what should workers do if their employer is refusing to comply?
So what the government has done is handed its policies over to businesses to sort of enact the welfare state a little bit, so to speak. So there's a couple of provisions that they've put in place. Number one is the coronavirus job retention scheme. This is that word furlough. I don't know if you'd ever heard of it before, but I hadn't, and now I suddenly am an expert in furlough. It basically means that you put your job to sleep for the time being, and the government will pay your employer 80% of your salary up to £2,500 a month, and that you can't work during that time for your employer. It's to prevent you from being laid off, effectively. It's to keep you in work and keep you receiving an income. The government will also pay your employer back the employer national insurance contribution and any pension auto enrollment contribution as well. So they keep it running. They give your employer a grant that is taxable, but you don't have to pay it back. If you're self-employed, there's another scheme. So under the self-employed income support scheme, the state will pay 80% of your average profits up to £2,500 a month. It's meant to be equal, but it isn't. And there's a lot of people that fall through the gaps of these. So just some examples, right? There are people who weren't on payroll on the 28th of February. So the 28th of February for the coronavirus job retention scheme is a really important date. That is how they tell that you were an employee of that company at that time and how they judge your wages. But some people have left. So they might have been laid off in a panic since around the 28th of February leading up to this. They also might have left for another job, which has now fallen through because their new employer can't claim for them. So we have managed to get clarity from the government that you can go back to your old employer and your old employer can take you back on and then furlough you and rehire you retrospectively to the point that you left. However, we're hearing that a lot of employers just don't want to do this. My big plea is, please step up. If you're an employer, the government will cover the wages and the contributions for that employee. So the cost, for you of covering their wages doesn't exist anymore. You're helping somebody without needing to lay out expenses yourself, without risking your business. So please, if anybody's in that position that you've let go or has left and are now stuck in that hole, please take them back on because you can, and the government has confirmed that. Then there's some other people that fall through the net. So salespeople, for example, who earn primarily sort of non-mandatory commission, their commission doesn't count in that calculation. Those on fixed term contracts, they're being told by employers that they can't be furloughed, even though in the normal run of business, it's entirely possible that their contract would be extended. Those who started self-employment in the last 18 months, so, under the self-employment support scheme, the state will pay. However, you need to have filed a 2018-19 tax return. In reality, that means you need to have been self-employed before that point. But even if you were and you were just employed for the 6 months before that, they judge it based on the whole year. And, if you'd only been working 6 months, then you might not be eligible because you have to have more than half of your earnings as self-employed for it to qualify. And by that point, you probably haven't quite clocked that up. There's also limited company directors who pay themselves primarily in dividends. So, if you're a limited company director, you might be your only employee. You pay yourself a little bit of PAYE. You can furlough yourself there, but a lot of your income may be from dividends. And the government has said that they won't cover that because they can't separate it from your normal investments. So there's a lot of people that fall in the gaps, and little tweaks to policy might be able to help save a few more of those people, but it is up to employers at the moment when it comes to the job retention scheme. And we are hearing that a lot of employers aren't doing maybe everything they can. And, I can understand it. If I was a business owner, and I'm not, I would have some real worries about the long-term health of my business. But this is something that the government has allowed businesses to do, and it can really keep people above the breadline, keep their head above water, and make sure that they've got a job, potentially got a job to come back to after all this is over.
Thank you so much for that really, really detailed and nuanced advice. It is such a fascinating time to be living in and to be working in, I'm sure from the perspective of a financial and consumer advisor, and also from the perspective of a sociologist. As you say, we're kind of learning new terms, and the pandemic is bringing under the microscope all of our differences and similarities and what a good economic program looks like. It's really asking some of those fundamental questions. So moving on to my next question for you. So obviously you briefly touched on this earlier in regards to the thousands of people who were stranded when the outbreak was first announced due to going on holiday and then finding that their return flight was cancelled or that their hotel wasn't even open. What would you recommend for people who were due to go on holiday, either those that were returned or those that have still got holidays booked and need to look at getting their money back? What would you say to any of those groups of people?
So the key is, at the moment, it seems to wait until the company itself, whether that's a travel agent or a package travel provider or a hotel provider, wait until they cancel the holiday for you, or cancel the part of your holiday. So you might need to wait for them to cancel. They might offer you a refund. They might offer you vouchers. At the moment, if it's a package holiday, under the package travel regulations, you are due a refund, and some are trying to get you to take vouchers. It's to save, their industry. So it's completely understandable, and it's worth weighing up whether you can afford to accept a voucher or a rescheduled date. That decision could keep somebody in work that little bit longer. Um, you know, the flights as well, we're hearing that, for example, EasyJet are making it really difficult for you to get a refund for any flight that's been cancelled, and they're just trying to get you to take vouchers online. But there's a piece of EU law in place that we are still very much part of that means you can get a refund, and you should push for that. You should go on the phone lines. You may need to bed in for a few hours with a cup of tea, but it may have to happen. Now, look, a lot of these cancellations are sort of happening in waves and a little bit at a time, and they're pushing the dates a little bit further out every week. You might need to wait if you're a few weeks or months ahead, see how it goes. If you're not happy with that, go to your travel insurer. So normally the trigger for travel insurance, if you already have it and you had it before the pandemic sort of became a known issue, you should be covered as long as there is a Foreign and Commonwealth Office warning in place. And right now that warning is don't travel anywhere for any reason that's non-essential. So that's the trigger. You should be able to claim. But sadly, if you didn't have travel insurance before, we don't know of any travel insurers now that are offering cover for coronavirus related cancellation. So, the other question I've been asked a lot as well is, should I book to travel? Can I safely book a holiday further down the line? To be honest, if it's for travel in the next few months, I would really strongly think twice about that, because you just don't know how long lockdown's going to last, how long it's going to take for the travel industry to get back up on its feet. They're selling flights and they're selling hotels, a little bit further down the line, but it doesn't mean that might not get cancelled later. And even if you had an annual travel insurance policy before, it might not cover you for a newly booked holiday. In fact, it probably won't, because you knew that coronavirus was an issue. So if you want to be on the safe side, I'd wait it out.
I find it really interesting how the kind of crisis nature of the pandemic is making us confront these really major questions and areas when it comes to, well, all areas of our life, but in particular our finances. So you mentioned briefly just then insurance. Insurance is something that we should always take out for our holidays, and lots of people chance it and don't take out insurance. But this pandemic has showed us kind of how important it is, and how important it is, as you were saying earlier, putting away savings and so on. So I think it's a real chance, as you've already outlined, Katie, if you do have the time and the mental capacity at the moment to actually, take a step back and really look at all of these different areas of your finances. Thanks so much. So moving on to weddings, which really does kind of intersect with also the holiday question, because it's a sad time, isn't it? People are cancelling their holidays, or their holidays have been ruined, and people's weddings are also being ruined and cancelled. What would you recommend for people who have weddings booked in the calendar year 2020?
Now, look, it's really awful for some of the people that had, March, April, May weddings booked. I spoke to, I'm getting married as well. I had to move my wedding, not because of coronavirus, and spoke to my wedding venue around early March. And, they were saying that they'd set up the night before the government said no more weddings. They'd set up for a whole wedding. They had the couple and their family all bedded out in the guest house there. And sadly, it all fell through overnight for them. So it was a really sad time for a lot of people that, had planned to have this joyous celebration, but unfortunately it is for a really good reason. It's to stop the spread of this awful virus and get this thing over and done with as quickly as possible. Now, I've answered quite a lot of questions about weddings in radio interviews and questions from users and listeners. And it's been difficult because all the situations vary, but the general rule of thumb is that, if you're being offered a reschedule, take that, don't cancel. Some wedding insurance will cover you. either for a policy term that's related to cancellation by the local authorities or government, or because of outbreak of infectious disease. They're the two things to look out for if you have wedding insurance. A lot of wedding insurers have now withdrawn from the market. So again, if you didn't have it before, we don't know of any that can offer it now. But, you may be offered a date that you're not really happy with. So I've heard of lots of people who paid for a sort of spring peak wedding who are now being offered, a Sunday or a Monday, or a winter wedding, another rescheduled date that for them doesn't seem very fair because of what they paid for. And that, that's normal to feel that way. But remember, for peak dates, you might have to book in normal circumstances 2 or even 3 years ahead to get that date. So maybe taking, it's my biggest advice is, look, it's all about the people. A wedding is all about the people. So take what you can get, try and minimize your losses. If you feel that you're not getting the value of the date that you had originally booked, try and haggle with your venue, sort of say, can you throw in corkage? Can you throw in welcome drinks? Can you throw in the guest house? Whatever that may be, try and sort of come to a negotiation with them. Remember, they're trying to keep afloat and be able to pay their bills in this time right now. They're taking a massive hit in profit, and they're not able to function at all. So, weigh up, is it worth having the argument, or can I accept the reschedule? Can I align as many of my big suppliers as possible? And that's the way that you're going to lose the least money.
I think that's such a human and helpful message, because, as I said before, we're now scrutinizing so many key questions about our everyday lives. And part of that scrutiny of our lives is realizing what's important and prioritizing what's important. So that's so important to integrate that with financial advice. Absolutely. So what is being recommended, moving on to the kind of housing and rental sectors? What is being recommended for renters and mortgage payers at the moment?
So we know that renters are disproportionately affected by the government's policies. They're not really being catered to as much as mortgage holders are. The government's agreed with a lot of banks, most of the banks, in fact, that you can try and take a 3-month mortgage payment holiday. Now, you'll have to be in really good health with your mortgage payments to get that. And if you can't get it, your bank should be doing its best to try and find some other helpful forbearance for you. Again, another word that I'd never heard of before that now I really do understand. Forbearance, this whole compassion to one another situation. It's worth noting at this point that we want companies and our financial providers to show us compassion, and we need to show it back to them as well, because again, they're changing policies top to bottom in days and minutes even that hadn't even been thought about before. They're changing call center structures and trying to move that customer service element to home working, and there's new rules on how to treat customers, and these things take time normally. So just bear with, and if you're not happy or you don't think that that's the latest information you're being given, you might need to bed in on the phone again and go back. But look, with mortgages, if you want to take the mortgage payment holiday, a lot of banks, in fact, most of them now that we know of, allow you to put the application in on the website. And that frees up the line for vulnerable customers, for people that perhaps aren't online, for those that need really urgent help and a pause to their payments. It basically gives you a break for 3 months. Your interest will still be added, and that will be added onto your payments in the future in most cases. But, for a big mortgage, that's probably an extra, 10 to 12 pounds a month on top of what you were paying before. Most people can sort of afford to take that further down the line. But renters, the story's a little bit different. So there is no sort of formal government policy at the moment that protects renters as such. However, they have, in their emergency legislation, stopped all eviction proceedings for 3 months. So they can't bring it for 3 months. They've got to give you 3 months notice if they're a landlord and they're not happy that you haven't paid. But in most cases, what I would say is talk to your landlord, explain the situation you're in, come up with an affordable repayment plan, see if there's any sort of wiggle room for them for paying a reduced rate for a little while and, pay that back later. Is there anything that they can do for you? And ask them as well, can they get a mortgage payment holiday on their buy-to-let mortgage? We know that a lot of lenders are offering that as well, off the back of government advice. So they can sort of take back a little bit of a break at the same time as giving you one. And see if, if you let them know that and just say, look, if you can do this for me, we'll stay in the house a little bit longer, we'll extend our contract, whatever that may be. See if you can negotiate a bit of a deal with your landlord. As well, if you're a renter or a homeowner, it's worth not disregarding universal credit. One of the things the government has done is lift a lot of areas of the universal credit payment and lift a lot of parts of the benefit assessment as well. And one of the things that makes quite a lot of difference right now is the housing allowance part. That's gone up quite a lot in some cases. It covers the bottom 30% of all market rents in any given area, in the area that you live in. So you might find that a universal credit payment is a lot more than you think and will really go a long way towards helping you. We're hearing that it's really difficult. The Universal Credit Helpline is getting 10 times the amount of applications and inquiries that it normally does. They're really strained. Again, try and give them a little bit of patience. Write down in your universal credit journal what's happened so that you've got a better chance of being called back later. And just try and wait it out. Bed in again, like I say, with a cup of tea. See if you can wait it out on the phone or online, and just have a little bit of patience if you can, and it might get you that payment that you need to get by right now.
Wow, I don't know about you, Katie, but I'm really learning so much during this crisis. And I can see that you are, from being in the role that you're in during this pandemic. As you say, words like forbearance and furlough and big questions like what is possible during a crisis that is challenging our normal status quo economic order, and what qualities can we practice? Compassion, patience, understanding. Absolutely. Thank you so much for that detailed answer. So, Katie, what is it that you would say to our student listeners, which we may have a lot of today? So what advice would you give them?
So we're hearing from a lot of our users at the moment who are students who've got really legitimate financial worries. One of them is that private landlords are still expecting them to pay rent, and they can do that. One of them is that they're worried that paying their tuition fees, if they pay it and don't pay it through the student loans company, it doesn't seem very fair because they're not getting anything out of the system right now. There aren't a lot of straight answers, sadly. There is a little bit of comfort that I can give you in that, we try to educate on the student finance system. There's a lot of political footballing when it comes to student loans, and we want people to understand it properly. So in short, and go and look this up on Money Saving Expert later if you can, and watch our film Student Loans Decoded, which is really helpful for understanding it. But in short, student loans should be treated like a graduate tax rather than a debt, right? So when you're in university, you don't repay anything, and you don't repay unless you're earning above a threshold, right? So you repay 9% of everything you earn above some £25,000 at the moment in your salary. So it's like an extra tax on top of the basic rate tax that you pay. And if you stop earning, you don't pay it, right? So it doesn't work like a normal day. It's not being recouped all the time, regardless of your situation. So, people are saying, that student debt should be wiped and all of this, but, you can also look at the other perspective. You're putting back into the system what you got out of it. If you're a higher earner, because you went to university, then you are paying back into the system more because, you're getting a 9% percentage of your income, putting that back into the taxpayer. So there are other ways to look at the student finance system as a whole. There's information on Money Saving Expert about maintenance loans and the expected parental contribution, which is hidden in the student loan system. How student loan repayment works and interest works. Go and look it up. See if you can tool yourself up and educate yourself a little bit more. Try and look around the political spin. We're not saying that the system right now is a good one, but we want people to understand how it does work so they make good financial decisions in the future instead of rushing to pay off their student loan. We've heard from people, for example, who were using inheritance to pay off their student loan because they were so worried about this debt that's weighing over their head. However, they weren't earning enough to repay it in the first place, and it gets wiped after 30 years. And the type of career that they had meant that they probably would repay very little of it as a whole over that 30 years. So they've just thrown money down the toilet. And it's things like that that we're trying to avoid. So like I said, go and tool up, see if you can understand it a bit more, and it might help you to make a better decision right now while you're worried about the impact of COVID-19 on your university education and finances.
That's such an interesting argument, just to unpack a little bit more what you said earlier about student loans. Some actually argue that the current student loan system is more of a, in inverted commas, socialist system than one without student fees, without tuition fees and without student loans, because higher earners pay back more. So if you then get a higher wage or a higher salary as a result of your university education, you will be paying back more because it's based on income. And as you say, there is so much misconception and misinformation about student loans and about student tenancies because of the complex and specific status of students and the complex and specific status of student loans, which are distinctly different from other kinds of loans. And just to add to your answer, the National Union of Students also has a campaign going on at the moment. So in Scotland, that's the Not Staying, Not Paying campaign. And they are lobbying both the UK and Scottish governments to release students from their tenancies without paying any further rent. So that's all currently in the pipeline. And we are watching with bated breath to see what the outcomes will be from some of the parliamentary debates, the final parliamentary debates on the COVID-19 rental policies at the end of this month. So thank you, Katie. Moving on to our closing questions, I would like to shift from the standard financial advice and bring it back to you and bring it back to the personal and the emotional, if you like. So I'm going to ask you the question, what do you think is the most challenging area to advise on at the moment?
Well, it has been really tough because we're hearing from a lot of people that are under significant financial strain right now, and particularly people who fall through those gaps that I mentioned earlier in employment help, or whose employers could take them back but aren't through no fault of their own. So, for example, the government has clarified that if you have to take time off work to look after children, your employer can furlough you for that rather than giving you just statutory sick pay. So there are people in really difficult positions and there isn't always an answer for them, and that's really difficult. We don't always have anything good to tell them, and that really hurts right now. And the government has done, I think, a fairly good job of trying to cover a lot of ground with their policies, but there are inevitably, as there always will be, some people who fall through the gaps. I guess the other thing that I struggle with is trying to help consumers where I can see the argument from both sides. So, for example, if you had tickets booked to a play by a small theatre company and, you want a refund for that because you're not going, but they only want to give you a voucher. Now they have the right to do that. And actually that might, keep that theatre company going and help their performers, people who right now probably again fall through those employment gaps themselves because they're self-employed and they've been on short-term contracts. So it's really difficult trying to sort of help people get the outcome that they want when you can see, the argument on the other side. So, most of the time at MSE, we're very much don't let your company take you for a ride. Don't let, your financial providers rip you off. But right now, like I said, we've got to give that forbearance back to them. They're doing what they can. These policies aren't filtering down as quickly as the government can hand them out or the banking industry can hand them out. And we sometimes just need to exercise a little bit of understanding if we can afford to. And I completely understand not everyone can, but if we can afford to, if we can maybe take those vouchers, take that rescheduled date, have a little bit of satisfaction from trying to help their industry and still get the service that you paid for.
Absolutely. It's so interesting to see these practices and performances of mutual exchange and mutual compassion going on at the moment. And I think you really hit the nail on the head in terms of why that is so important to embody in our lives. We're all in the same boat throughout this pandemic. And in that way, we're seeing this pandemic almost equalize groups of people in many ways. But focusing on some of the marginalised groups in society and their experiences of life and of finances at the moment. For example, the kind of gendered dynamics of COVID-19. How would you say, for example, women are being disproportionately affected by the pandemic and by the government's responses?
So at any time of the year, pandemic or not, women have a financial burden that men don't. They're disproportionately saving, they're disproportionately getting ready for retirement, they're disproportionately affected in their careers by childcare. And there's several reasons for that. Stats show that, less than 1% are taking up shared parental leave, right? Because there's a gender pay gap. If you are in a same-sex relationship and you choose to start a family, and the choice is for, the higher earner to keep their full pay for longer, and that is the man, then a woman is going to be the one that takes the longer time off to look after their newborn, right? So those career limiting life changes give you a bit of a motherhood penalty, right? There's other things as well. So many women, especially mothers, have little or no savings, disproportionately compared to men, and have lower retirement savings. Scottish Widows have said in the past that men are benefiting from an additional £78,000 in their pension pot at retirement. And, we're living longer than men, but with iller health. So the burden on our later life is a lot worse as well. And again, higher numbers of girls and women than men and boys experience domestic abuse, including financial coercion. So, we've heard recently that the National Domestic Abuse Helpline has seen a 25% increase in calls since lockdown. And that's really difficult for us. And there are some things, like women, the median weekly pay for female full-time employees was £528 last year compared to £628 for male full-time employees. So, if you're being furloughed by the government at that £2,500 a month cut-off, that means a bigger drop for men, but women are more likely to fall below that £2,500 in the first place, so their income will be lower naturally. So, women have always got this sort of penalty for various life moments that seem to disproportionately affect them in the society that we currently live in. And some policies are trying to help, like statutory shared parental leave, but the take up of that, for example, like I said, can't be helped unless the gender pay gap is closed. So we're operating right now in a time of great change in terms of women's rights and women's pay and women's financial status. And there's a lot of companies out there and organisations who are trying to empower women to put more money aside earlier, to save into their pensions properly very quickly, to take advantage of pensions auto-enrolment, to save, to grow their money as well, whether that's through interest or through investment. Women also don't invest as much as men. They're naturally more risk averse. So everything that's happening with the coronavirus pandemic has a knock-on effect because we're less prepared. We have less of a buffer to deal with these situations. So, even if you're not a person that's really interested in money, you really hate sitting down and doing that job, it's really worth tooling yourself up and trying to be part of the change so that, in 40, 50 years' time, when we come to retire, our situations are a lot better. We've closed that gap a little bit and we're passing on our learnings to our children and grandchildren.
Wow, it's so refreshing to hear a consumer expert centre the experiences of women, because all the time when we talk about finance, we baseline and we universalise men's experiences of the workplace and of money. So, and we often see finance and economy in genderless ways. What other experiences do you think it's important to centre? So, for example, recently we did a podcast on single mothers, and that explored the benefit system in the context of the coronavirus. We talked about, in some of our podcasts, marginalised groups such as refugees and asylum seekers and ethnic minorities in the UK. Are any of these experiences of interest to you? What do you hope to learn more of as you move through the pandemic as a consumer expert?
Yeah, so I don't claim to be, an amazing ally to all the various groups of non-privilege, and I'm trying to better myself all the time in that way and try and understand non-privilege. I'm in a relationship with somebody of an ethnic minority, and that's been a really interesting learning curve for me as well. So I can't speak to at the moment, the financial impact and how it affects people from perhaps low income backgrounds, from BAME backgrounds, as well as I can about women, because women is just an area that I'm particularly interested in. So I won't claim to be an expert there, and I do recommend looking up some of the statistics, because there's been some stuff out this week suggesting that BAME people are disproportionately affected as well by the coronavirus pandemic financially. However, there's another side as well. You talked about single parents, definitely massively impacted, because they don't have the choice of finding somebody else to share childcare with. They can't agree with their employer to do maybe half the time they were doing before and get paid part-time, because they don't have another person to share that burden with. And just to kind of be a little bit more morbid at the moment as well, there could be a big impact a lot further down the line than we expect. Recent figures are showing that men are more likely to die from COVID-19 in all age groups than women are. And we don't know if that's a feature of the disease or not, but death isn't expensive for the dead, it's expensive for the living. And, according to the ONS, most of the couples and cohabiting couples, married couples, civil partnered couples in this country, the large proportion of them are same sex, right? So women will be really disproportionately affected by bereavement and by widowing further down the line. It's a really difficult situation, and there are groups of people who just will find it harder than others. And that counts for lots of financial areas, but particularly this crisis, because the impact is happening to people that don't normally experience otherness in any ways. So if people who normally are in lots of positions of privilege, middle income, cis white male, they are experiencing the impact right now. So how are the people that were experiencing non-privilege before supposed to feel? It's obviously going to be a much harder shockwave for them.
Absolutely. I think your answer has shown that it's so important for us to be gathering disaggregated data on the impacts of COVID-19. So data that pays attention to the distinctions of race and age and sex and so on, because it's affecting those groups in distinct ways. But thank you for your answer there. It must leave your head absolutely spinning, working in finance, to just think of all of the different nuanced ways in which financial advice has to be delivered at the moment for people with particular family models, for people with particular experiences of gender or sexuality or citizenship. I mean, there's just so many areas to be thinking of. And as you say, you just can't be an expert in them all. But as you say, you are committed to learning more, as I am as well, which is why it's been such a pleasure to do these podcasts and talk to such a variety of people. And in regards to your point about death, we are doing a podcast soon with somebody who works in a funeral parlour. So I think it's really important that we're confronting some of those really difficult and morbid questions about the levels of death that we are going to see from this pandemic, and being prepared for that financially and emotionally, and thinking about what that will mean for our lives. Great. So thank you. Moving on to the last question. So this is my final question for you today, Katie, before we wrap up. What financial learnings do you hope will come from the pandemic? That can be learnings that you yourself may gain, or learnings that you hope for the general population to gain.
Well, the first thing is that I hope people are starting to give themselves their first money makeover, so to speak. People who perhaps didn't do that before, had been with the same energy supplier for 20 years, who had got, BT for their broadband because that's all they'd heard of. I hope that they do that first financial money makeover and then carry on that good habit year on year, because that's the way that you are going to be an active and competitive consumer. You're going to cut your household bills. You're going to make sure that what you get, you're going to pay as little as possible for, with good service, of course, right? So I'm hoping that that'll encourage new good financial savings habits. We're still trying to get everybody in the UK financially educated. It is not that long ago when we got it onto the national curriculum, and even then it barely says anything. It basically, I'm paraphrasing, but it basically just says teach financial education. So, there's charities out there that are trying to increase the provision and help schools to deliver it better, but us as adults, we can be really bad consumers as well. So I'm really hoping that people pick up some really good new habits. I think that, putting away a rainy day fund, we've always said, try and cover 1 month's income if you can, or even better 3, so that you can cope with lost wages should something happen to you or something happen to your company. We've heard about Thomas Cook folding and staff not getting their wages and having to go through the administration process. That's a recent example where a rainy day fund can really serve you well. So I hope that people will kind of see, not to downgrade the scale and unexpectedness of this COVID-19 pandemic, but understand, the importance of having a little bit of a financial buffer if they can afford to kind of build that up. It might take a year or a little bit longer to kind of add to that pot, but having it there will make you feel so much better. And then, I hope that in general, people understand their employment a bit better. People are very quick to sign contracts to join a company, to, just think about the task at hand when they choose a job rather than the benefits that a company might offer you, whether that's a better maternity pay or, if you're a man, can you get 6 months full pay from the company for parental leave, whether it's a life assurance policy that really looks attractive or a much higher pension contribution from your employer. And I think being put in difficult positions with our employment right now has forced us to look over those terms and look over what's available to us and our rights as an employee. So I hope people will consider that a lot more as well and look at what companies can offer you. And if you as an employee choose a company that offers you something more, it forces their competitors to kind of catch up and be more competitive. So, there's a few things that I hope will come out of this. Mostly, I just hope that the majority of the population comes out of this safe and well, and aren't pushed too far below the breadline, that they can cope with the government's help that's available, or at least with universal credit. I'm glad to hear that universal credit has kind of helped a lot of people and has given a bit more cash than it did before. But it's sad that we need that in the first place, because we have too many people under the poverty line. And I really wish that some of the things that are being done now, like housing the homeless through this crisis, well, why couldn't they have been done before? That's a real question that we're going to be holding the government, not us, but the opposition and campaigners will be doing to hold the government to account on these issues after this is all over.
Thank you for finishing on such a powerful note there. Well, listeners, I hope you have learned as much as I have. And Katie, you've absolutely blown me away. Thank you for giving up your precious time. I know you're working in very pressurized conditions, and thank you for, from the bottom of my heart, for your commitments to trustworthy advice, which is what everybody needs right now. And I also absolutely echo your sentiments about the kind of democratization of financial education and a brighter future once this is all over. Is there anything final that you would like to say? I would just like to say that I'm so thankful for people like you that have knowledge at my fingertips like this, and I can just reach out to and get such expert advice. Is there anything you would like to put out to the world in the last few seconds of the podcast?
Yeah, in general, if you are worried about any aspect of your finances, MSE has 4 separate guides now, covering everything from your employment rights to your finance help and your bills, to even just lockdown help, like Netflix tricks and NHS discounts, everything that you can think of. So we're doing our best. We're adding to it. We're updating it as quickly as we can as things change. Secondly, thank you very much for having me on, Poppy. Starting a podcast and bringing a ray of light in this sort of time of darkness is really helping people to kind of pick apart what's going on here and try and think about a brighter future down the line. So,
thank you. Well, I think that sociologists have a bit of a responsibility at the moment to be putting out content on the pandemic and analysing the pandemic with the sociological lens and skills that we have, because it's not just economists and politicians and scientists and health policy experts and so on that we need, but we also do need social scientists that are measuring and observing the social. So who knows, hopefully this will become a historical artefact going forward. Well, thank you very much, Katie. We're going to finish there.